Nurse Lucy Letby has today been convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to kill 6 more, making her the UK's most prolific child killer of modern times. She targeted the tiny patients she was meant to be looking after at the Countess of Chester Hospital neonatal ward in 2015 and 2016. The jurors at Manchester Crown Court were unable to reach verdicts on attempted murder charges relating to 4 other babies. She was found not guilty of 2 other counts of attempted murder. So what happens now? Joseph Kotrie Monson is a criminal lawyer at Mary Monson Solicitors, a leading infant homicide and serious injury firm. Joseph, good evening.
Good evening, Stephen.
It's just, look, I don't want to sound cliched about this, but I just have to say it out loud. It is beyond belief that a human being has the capability of doing this.
Stephen, I think I've been running out of adjectives because nothing seems to do the horror of this justice. As a father of a daughter myself, you don't have to be connected to this case to feel. We don't even get as far as revulsion. It just doesn't compute the horror, and that overused but probably appropriate word, evil, here. Evil's not a word that you hear lawyers use a lot, let alone defense lawyers. But the nation is very much in shock and not gripped in the kind of voyeuristic way that we might be over a usual tabloid story. We feel for these parents and these poor defenseless babies. Of course, it's that which makes this most aggravated. These weren't just vulnerable victims, but they were in this woman's care, and she not only used that skill to put an end to them, but she also used that skill to vary her murder techniques to avoid detection. Sickening.
Where does this case rank, Joseph, in terms of infant homicide?
There's nothing that compares to this since the terrible Moors murders, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. Those cases, of course, included recordings of the killings, audio recordings. One thing that parents are deprived of in this case is, as I heard from one, I think a police liaison officer, saying we don't know why our children were selected, because in the throes of all of the grief, it's trying to make sense of something so malicious that prevents the ability to move on even further, that closure, that grasp towards understanding when you're the victim of something so horrific and so apparently random. But this is, I've been asked today in the specialist work that we do in this complex area, complex pediatrics, very difficult cases, because the determining cause of death in infants is very, very difficult, and it's very, very important that the right people go to prison, and the people who and in circumstances where someone isn't guilty, that they're not convicted just on the basis of these feelings, but of evidence. These cases are so difficult, but there's nothing in my experience that
Is it because of the size of the? Is it because of the size of the human body? Is that why the cases are so difficult?
The first time I was instructed in a case involving an infant homicide, which was absolutely far from clear cut. It was alleged infant homicide, and I asked, in fact, my uncle, Professor John Monson, who's a specialist he was the head of endocrinology at Barts and the Royal London, and he said to me, this area, you can't talk to me about growth and bones. I deal with adults. This area is massively pediatric, and there's the gulf in research and experience, because it's such a small window of research, because of course the age range is so narrow, by which time the human body changes so much. it means that often determining cause of death is very difficult. And this, we have verdicts, but this was not a straightforward trial. They were majority verdicts directed by the judge rather than unanimous after weeks of deliberation. And Letby was still not convicted of all the counts. Deliberation itself took weeks. That evidence was strong, but it was largely circumstantial. The coincidence, the massive coincidence, thank God that it was recorded, of Letby on the ward at key times, and those devastating diary pages. Well, in the end, they did for her, and they were overwhelming. Good job they existed.
Talk to us about those diary pages, Joseph.
From a defence, if I'm putting myself in the position of somebody advising a defendant, well, there was already the cloud of suspicion. There's the point at which colleagues are first interested, then suspicious, then convinced. And perhaps we'll talk about Dr. Breary, who, if he'd been listened to, a further death scandalously appears that it would have been prevented. But that suspicion turns into a knock at the door. At that point, right thinking, objective listener or kind of person on the street, so to speak, Stephen, may well say, well, listen, coincidences do happen. What else is there? And you don't need a whole lot once you've got a coincidence of large numbers of unexplained deaths, some similar, some different. But once you get to the stage that you fall across something like that, it's the kind of discovery of an Aladdin's cave that old school detectives used to talk about when they were after stolen goods. You find a piece of evidence like that, whatever the metaphor, the smoking gun. Not just that, they took the unusual step, Stephen, of also publishing them during the trial. I think that was interesting, that they were scraggly. They looked disjointed. That you don't have to be a handwriting expert to see that the state of mind of the writer was visible on the page. And I couldn't help thinking at the time that the prosecutors might be concerned that if this person was convicted or acquitted, people might then come back and say, well, what was going on here? And I think by publishing those and making sure, crucially, the jury didn't see them, because that's the big risk. And that's why prosecutors, generally speaking, playing it by the book shouldn't. I think they were concerned that people might have been saying, well, this could have been a massive coincidence. Otherwise, I think that once most people saw those documents, well, we'll let the jury make their decisions, won't we? But we won't argue with it if they convict.
You mentioned him a moment ago, the unit's lead consultant, Dr. Stephen Breary, and he first raised concerns about Letby as far back as October 2015.
I have to say, this is the point at which I froze and became speechless. It's hard right now for me to retain my composure when I hear about, in the context of a grotesque bombshell like that people are talking about a non-statutory inquiry. These families who have behaved with dignity and restraint through all of this, through crippling paralysis of grief, deserve an inquiry in the context of a scandalous revelation like that clearly points to the strong possibility that a hospital failure contributed to the death of a child, whether they did it or not. That doesn't mean they're not responsible. And the idea somehow that an inquiry conducted on an informal basis, where there'll be no powers to compel witnesses to give evidence, somehow has the teeth to address that in circumstances where they haven't even achieved convictions for all the accounts. I have to say, defense lawyer, prosecution lawyer, man on the street, mother, father, I'm disgusted. And I hope, as has happened in the past, when informal inquiries in response to national scandals have ended up as a result of public pressure. Politicians get involved and say, no, we will be doing a proper judge-led inquiry with some.
But what type of inquiry? I thought this was going to be, Joseph, a public inquiry. So
they are not going to have an inquiry that, as things stand, they're talking about an inquiry in which there will not be powers to compel witnesses. And you must forgive me. I'm not an inquests lawyer. I'm a criminal lawyer, but I know that the ability in the inquiry, as it's currently proposed, for documents and individuals to be requested to attend or be accessed, conversely. That is not what we are looking at. And we're looking at circumstances where the implication is that the alarm was raised, but the trust or the hospital apparently, one explanation could be as a result of fear of scandal themselves, or a kind of subconscious bias or panic, decided not to deal with this in a way that escalated it. Now, if that's the case, a similar approach, anything less but absolute teeth and transparency in the inquiry, is completely inappropriate and an insult to the grief and the restraint and the fundamental decency of the way these families have behaved in the course of feelings that I simply can't imagine, and nobody except they can.
So Dr. Stephen Breary raises this, as I said, 2015. To what extent were his concerns investigated? Did the trust do anything when he first raised this? And he's the lead consultant in the unit.
Witnesses. Can I suggest this? It's incredibly easy, once there's a whiff of scandal, to take somebody away from frontline duties without it impugning their character or impinging upon their career. It happens all the time, because whenever I have a client in the medical profession, I've represented many doctors up to consultant, even professor level. Whenever an allegation is made, even if it's regarded generally as baseless. For example, I've had a situation where an extremely mentally ill and paranoid mental health patient made an accusation that simply didn't make sense against the doctor. Nevertheless, as a precaution and protection, not just for the patient, but for him and other patients, just to make sure that it was completely visible that everything's being done properly, what you do, you put that person in a role for a period of time while an investigation is underway, where they don't have contact with patients. And the NHS has all of these mechanisms in place. So what we can say, Stephen, with confidence, is no such steps were taken. Hence the emotive tone I have now, and my struggle to contain my disappointment and worse.
The judge will be looking at a number of aggravating factors here. Presumably, the likes of the amount of the vulnerability of the victims.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Stephen, the things that repulse us the most and make us the most upset are the aggravating features that, in my view and in the view of, I suspect, most of my senior peers, mean that this case will result in a whole life term. Life will mean life. I know you and I over the years have discussed sentences in murder cases. As I recall, this will be a real life sentence. The age of the victims, their vulnerability, the fact that they relied in the way that a child relies absolutely on a parent, on the care of this professional, the abuse of that trust. But thinking about it, the way that the confidence in the system that the public have as a result of that well-publicized abuse of trust. This is something that could lead, and it shouldn't. Steps are being taken. This was a psychotic or psychopathic serial killer, not one of the good people of the NHS that we all love and treasure so much. But the reality is that this type of behavior, this type of conduct can undermine our trust in the health service. That can result in people not going for help when they need it. That's wrong, but it can happen. The knock-on consequences socially as a result of these type of scandals are huge. That will be an aggravating factor. And possibly the other major factor, extreme planning and calculation. This wasn't in the throes of an emotion. Varying murder techniques trying to avoid detection. I mean, this was coldly calculating, and that will be emphasised, I'm certain, by the judge in sentencing remarks.
Joseph, thank you as always, sir. Thank you very much indeed.